Thanks. Welcome back, everybody. We shall kick off the next session, Mojaloop releases and core maintenance. Take it away, Sam.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you, Mojaloop Foundation, again for giving us this opportunity. Let's get to the Mojaloop releases and the core maintenance update for PI 16. Before I talk about the contributors, if you want to see your name here, it's fairly straightforward. Look at the backlog of issues. There is much work to be done in Mojaloop open source community. There's a huge backlog. If you have questions, reach out to Miguel or myself or Louis or anyone else. And take up some of it or one of the items and either fix a bug or implement a feature or something, and then we can recognize you. I hope this list covers most of the contributors that I know. Some like David Fry has been instrumental on our IC work. Emerson Georgi, Kevin, Vijay have been taking the lead on the TTK stream. And we have Juan and others who are leading the core connector and payment manager integration side of things. We also actually have Matt Kingston, who is now doing the open source work on Finance Portal V2, which is open source as well. Of course, we have Luis, Miguel, Miller, and several others who are everything open source about Mojaloop. And of course, there are Shishi and Siva here, whom I've included, who have done some fixes and some enhancements to some of the issues. And of course, Tom, along with the Vijay on infrastructure and Helm release upgrades, enhancements as well. And of course, Miller and Warren on roadmap and general direction and support for the Mojaloop open source community. With that, I'll quickly go over the agenda. So I'll cover the PI 15 overview. We'll look at the goals from the product deck. And then Miguel will walk us through the upgrade strategy guide that we were able to produce. And then we'll look at Mojaloop releases that were made during this PI, version 13.01 and version 13.02, which is the latest stable release. And we'll talk about two of the releases that are in the pipeline, version 13.10 and V14, which will come at a later time in the next PI. We have David here on as well. So we have Louis, Tom, Miguel, myself, and David Fry presenting today. And David Fry will talk about the infrastructure as code update. And then we'll wrap up with some logical candidates for the roadmap for PI 16. A quick glimpse of the various phases. Won't go into detail here, but we are in phase 5, PI 16, the last program increment in this phase. And not very surprising, but we'll be kicking off phase 6 in January of next year. So looking forward to that. Also quickly wanted to cover the APIs that are currently implemented. In program increment community events previously, we used to look at the use case level and resource level as well. We can go back to that if the committee or if you want to look at it. But here, at least we want to cover the high level version of that. So we have the FSP interoperability API version 1.1 implemented, which is primarily focused on the clearing and the 3 phases that Mojaloop is about. And then we have the settlement API version 2.0, which has the continuous growth settlement, deferred settlement, and support for multiple currencies as well. There is actually a settlement to V3, which is currently in design, as Michael Richards is leading the design and that work stream. We have the administration API version 1.0, which is actually being enhanced as well. The third-party payment initiation 3PPI API version 1.0, I kept as an approximate symbol there because the implementation is there, and the version 1.0 is being reviewed by the CCB in its final stages. Once it is approved by the CCB, it will be formally named as version 1.0. The implementation is also there. It's recently been, we'll look at this in more detail. Luis will cover this, where it's now included as part of Mojaloop main charts. The FX API is currently in design phase. It's not been implemented yet in Mojaloop open source. So that is, we'll cover an update regarding that in the testing toolkit phase as well, and hopefully in separate sessions focused on FX. So this is where we started off PI 15 with. We wanted to publish two significant Mojaloop releases. Version 13.01, we wanted to be well tested and published. And in addition to that, make a regression test plan part of the documentation back in human readable form. Excuse me. We were able to accomplish that. That was done. Supporting the sandbox team, and we had a successful hackathon based on that. I hope Innocent will get a chance to talk about it on one of the breakout sessions or end of day sessions. And we have the 3 PPI functionality included as part of Mojaloop main charts. Mojaloop V14, we wanted to do a V14 of Mojaloop release, but we had to take a slight change in direction. And instead of that, we published a V13.02 Helm release, Mojaloop release. And the next one we had to rename it as V13.10 for the same reason, because we have the PISP functionality as part of that. So we were able to accomplish it. It's just that instead of V14, we had to push it back and focus on another patch release and a minor version update release as well. So to see that clearly, we had 2 Mojaloop releases during this PI. We were able to support current adopters and implementers as they had several issues with things we'll go into detail later on. Things such as Burmese characters, Unicode characters that were different from normal other Unicode characters that you used previously, like the Spanish characters, accents, and things like that. And then obviously we saw in the reference architecture stream update about the support done there. We have the merging of PSP features done and support for that. The 2 items here in yellow, we have those in progress, version 13.10 of Mojaloop and V14. There's a POC that is finished, but the actual release candidate itself is still in the pipeline. And then we have infrastructure as code for Mojaloop V12 initially published, which also has support for version 13 now. Some numbers here, I provided a link here if you want to look at the issues covered. Were about 18 bugs fixed and close to 40 issues resolved. And with that, I'll stop sharing and pass it to Miguel to start with update strategy and go into Mojaloop releases. Thank you. Miguel. You're on mute, Miguel, if you can unmute.
Okay. Yep. Can you guys see my screen?
We can hear you, and now we can see it. Yep.
Okay. All right. So, during the PI, there was a lot of questions about how to handle the upgrading of Mojaloop, and as such, a upgrade strategy was one of the outcomes of that. So this is a document that's been published as part of the deployment guide. The link's down below. I'm actually just going to quickly take you guys through. So on the main Mojaloop website, if you go to technology link over here, you go to technical docs. This should take you to the technical documentation website. And under the deployment guide, which might be closed, you can open it up over here and you can see the upgrade strategy guide. So this guide is potentially going to be enhanced in future for anything that has to do with upgrading. At the moment, we have a section specifically about how to handle Helm upgrades. And in it, we have 2 main sections. We have one that describes how to handle non-breaking releases. So if you install Mojaloop and there's a new version of a Helm version for Mojaloop release available, you can just do a straight upgrade, and there should be no issues or problems with that. And if necessary, you can even roll it back by using a Helm command to do that. The more interesting bit is really about when you have breaking releases. And that can be subdivided into 2 sections depending on your deployment topology. you have either deployed Mojaloop with the default backend dependencies. And when I say default backend dependencies, I'm talking about the data stores, I'm talking about Kafka, etc. You've deployed Mojaloop with those tightly integrated, or you've deployed them with a separate deployment or separate deployments for those backend dependencies, which is actually the recommended approach. It's the best practice approach. And that allows you to manage them and upgrade them independently of Mojaloop. So if you are thinking of installing Mojaloop, I would really strongly recommend you go with that approach. And it looks something like this, right? So just ignore the right side of the diagram for now. You have a Mojaloop deployment and you have the backend dependencies installed as a separate entity. And if you have a breaking release and you have the situation like this, it doesn't mean that there's a breaking release within the Mojaloop components. It's just a Helm breaking release. And that means that the backend and dependencies are all supportive of the new version as well. So what you can do is you can deploy a new version in parallel, and you can then share the same database between the two. And that means then you can actually migrate people from one side, from the old to the new, and you can validate the new version of Mojaloop before switching everyone over and then decommissioning the old site. There is then the second option, where there are breaking changes. And what that means is you're most likely going to have problems with the data stores as well. And this is specifically from a Helm perspective once again. But in this scenario, for example, we have Mojaloop with a tight coupling of the actual data stores here. And what we recommend you do is you would then deploy a new backend dependency in a separate deployment, and you could then deploy Mojaloop in parallel and connect those two, and then you would set up a sync and data migration between the two. And you would basically move the information over, and then you would schedule a maintenance window where you could potentially shut that down, enforce that all the data, and ensure the data is in sync before you actually move everything over between the old and the new environments. And of course, we have some examples. You have the steps that you can take to do that. So I think this is really like a good starting place for a discussion on how you can manage your Helm deployments and how you can do your upgrades going forward. And I hope it also shows you, gives you a better idea of how you should expect to deploy Mojaloop. And we'll touch on that a bit later again when we start talking about version 14. So moving on to the releases that we've done in PI 16. So I think Sam already touched some of the points. I'm doing this a little bit differently from the previous PIs. I'm trying to stay away from the slides. I'm trying to go more to the actual documentation and the source of the truth. So over here we have releases where we can go to the release tags. We have release reports, and I'll show you some of these as I'm explaining them. So for 13.02, let's actually go to the release notes themselves. So these are available on the Helm repo. So if you go to GitHub, Mojaloop/Helm, and on the far right, you'll see releases here. And you can click on that, and that gives you a full breakdown of everything that's available in the release. It gives you what maintenance updates were made, what new features there were, what bug fixes were made in this release, the application versions specifically for each of the Mojaloop components. You can even see what versions they were upgraded from. So for example, the transaction request service was in the previous release 11.15, now it's 11.17. And of course, we also provide links to the individual release notes for each of the components here. We also have a section on breaking changes. If there are any, there are none in this release, but it's worth obviously keeping eyes open for that. And we also have a section for upgrade notes. So when you're upgrading to this version, be aware that there might be something you need to do, or maybe if there's a known issue when upgrading, there might be some information on how to address it. And in this example, there is. So some of the biggest changes in this release were for fixes for Unicode characters, issues that our friends at Myanmar have experienced. And this is actually a follow-up to 13.01 release where we updated the interface specification to support a wider character set. And this is pretty much going to, and updating the quoting service to support a wider database character set for Unicode characters. And it actually has migration scripts that have been added to set the necessary table fields to the right character encoding going forward. And this pretty much talks about how that happens. Be aware of this, and there might be some little issues that you might be aware of. So in this case, the migration scripts will automatically upgrade your tables and rows to Unicode. If you want to roll that back, you can, but it will be a manual process. Something else also worth pointing out, for example, here for the TTK, the testing toolkits configuration, there are some additional configurations that need to be set as well. So if you have a customized TTK configuration, you need to be aware of this and you need to add that in. A third point over here, for example, talks about if you do an upgrade with the Mojaloop simulators, there was a bug where there would be duplicate environment variables that get generated due to the way that it programmatically loops to create the simulators. So this talks about if you get this error, it's probably because there's a duplicate environment variable. Just be aware of it. You can easily fix it by manually just going there and removing the duplicate environment variable, and then you can run the upgrade. And then subsequent upgrades from that point on, you should not have that issue going forward. There's also a section on testing notes. So pretty much how this was tested, what versions of Kubernetes the Ingress controller used, the testing toolkit, test cases that were used, etc. So information on how that was actually done. There's a section on known issues, right? So there's no major known issues here. There's just some things you might need to be aware of. Most of these issues actually impact the Helm deployment. So for example, support for Kubernetes 1.22. I will once again address, or we are going to address that in version 14 going forward, and also compatibility issues with the new versions of the Ingress controller because they match the API versions of Kubernetes 1.22. In this release, there was also another change that was introduced, and we introduced checksum annotations for all services. And this will ensure that any changes are made to configs or secrets. It will ensure that those services are restarted with minimal disruption. So it's just it's a really convenient way to now basically a lot of the time in the past, some people had to go and restart certain containers, and this is now managed automatically by the Kubernetes infrastructure for you. Moving on to 13.10, I'm actually going to take you through a release report since we have a release notes, but they are still work in progress. So I think the release report is pretty much going to be the best thing to do with regard to that. So if we come to Mojaloop Projects GitHub page, you'll see there's a ZenHub tab. You do need a plugin for ZenHub for this, be aware, so you can install it. And then on GitHub, then you'll see this tab appear when you're on this project. And if you click on it, you'll see the information. In fact, you can go to our board, where this is where we track all the work that's been done, etc., what's completed, what's in review, what's in progress, as well as our backlogs, etc. But I think the interesting thing for this discussion is really the release reports. And here you can see closed releases that we previously have had, as well as new ones. So 13.10, for example, if I open that, you can actually see the features, the bugs, etc., that are included in this release. And you can see as to what status they are, how many we still have open, how many we've closed, etc. And you can get a good estimate in terms of how far we are with that release. This release actually originally was supposed to be 3.03, as Sam said, but it included some critical bugs, specifically around the version 1.1 for transfers, over here for settlements, over there. And what we saw when you're using 1.1 is the transfers weren't being correctly added to settlement windows. So that's been fixed. There was also a patch notification callbacks that were not setting the correct headers as expected. That's also fixed. And interesting enough, the account lookup service for put party sub-ID error callbacks was not linked up to the implementation. So that was added and that was linked. And that's in place now. But as a result of the addition of the third-party API, we decided to bump the minor version instead. So I'm going to hand over to Lewis to talk about that, and then I'll come back to version 14 afterwards.
Cool. Thanks, Miguel. Can you go back to the slides, please?
Yep. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, all good. Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Lewis. I've been working on a few things, one of them being the third-party API support in Mojaloop Helm charts. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about 3PPI or PISP tomorrow, but just briefly, I wanted to just highlight this because it fits in quite well. in the next minor version release, 13.1.0 of Mojaloop, we're going to have support for our third-party services. And what you see on the right-hand side there is the configuration that you need to do in order to turn it on. It's off by default, but when you set those sorts of configuration things in your values.yaml file, when you're doing your Helm install, that will magically turn on all the third-party API stuff. And on the left is just a little diagram that shows the actual services that get deployed, and their dependencies. And there's a guide in that link below, which is just inside of our Mojaloop Helm repository. But that guide talks you through how do you deploy Mojaloop with third-party API support. Importantly, you can also kind of deploy it alongside. If you've got an existing Mojaloop deployment, you could potentially deploy the third-party support alongside existing Mojaloop, maybe in a different namespace, whatever you want to do. It is flexible in that regard. And next slide, Miguel, I'll just talk through as well. Additionally, we've added, it's one thing to add the API support, but you also need to prove that the API that you've added works. So in the Mojaloop Simulator Helm subchart, there's a new option to enable the third-party SDK. And when that is enabled, you have the ability then to test the third-party API. And finally, we have a testing toolkit collection that's currently in progress that I'm working on for our end-to-end tests of the third-party API. And now we've got these all written in our kind of local jest runner, and now we're just translating them to be testing toolkit specific, so that they're a bit more general and also a lot more user-friendly to run and use and understand. So that final item is on our own PISP repo, but it's making its way into the testing toolkit collections, coming to a testing toolkit near you, I think is the way to put it. Cool. Miguel, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you. Right, so let's go back to version 14 release. So from the previous PI, we planned to have this to finish this work, this PI. However, this was delayed as a result of the work being carried out for 13.01, 13.10, 2.13.10 releases that we kind of just covered just now. And this was mainly due to resource constraints and reprioritizations, etc. Version 14 is a major release as it requires a lot of refactoring of the current Helm charts to address some of the key issues, which you can actually see under the first point there. And this POC would be, take note that there was no new core, i.e. no non-Helm features that were actually planned for version 14. Just to iterate some of the stuff you saw in the business ops framework, that was coming along. I don't think it was ever foreseen to be necessarily part of 14, but maybe another version of 14. But now we have the opportunity to potentially include it as part of the 14 release going forward. Regardless, we decided at the start of the PI to first do a POC, really to see what the best approach is to define the new structure with the common reusable templates going forward, and ensure that this POC can also be reviewed by the community and see how best we can support the ongoing ARC work. So if we look at the issues, the first one was removing external dependencies that are tightly integrated into the Mojaloop Helm charts. So once again, just going back to the update strategy guide, it really is recommended that you separate these two. And one of the reasons we want to remove them is also to kind of make sure that people are aware, or at least force them to think about, I want to deploy my backends and I want to deploy Mojaloop. And now it's going to be a two-step process, at least if you're running something from a development, local environment, etc. But more importantly, we had issues with the tight coupling. Those external dependencies are not managed by us. So if something changed, if those charts were maintained, if they were deprecated, that would impact us quite greatly. And we had no control over basically how to manage the Mojaloop versioning going forward. And it really disrupts you guys as well. So we want to actually remove those. And in fact, as part of the POC, we've already set up an example backend dependency chart, which comes to point 2, which is also about replacing our deprecated Helm dependencies. And for the POC, we just use MySQL and Kafka as examples, but we've created this example dependency chart. And once again, it's an example. We don't want people to take it verbatim and go and use that and deploy that in a production environment, QA environment. It is perfectly adequate for a dev environment or POC environment, etc. But in theory, you should be making sure that you deploy those dependencies separately and manage them separately so you can manage their life cycles independently. However, you can use the example chart as an example. So you can go there and look, okay, how should I deploy MySQL? You can use that chart and you can use those configurations, etc. Another big point is about Mojaloop Helm support for Kubernetes 1.22. The new versions of Kubernetes 1.22 onwards. So this needs some major refactoring because of deprecated APIs within Kubernetes itself, and we want to make sure we want to support that and potentially also support future versions and put ourselves in the right place to do that. And also previously mentioned, we want to also support the new versions of the Ingress controllers going forward, which are incompatible with the version 13 Helm charts at the moment. There's a couple of other issues that we also want to add in: better support for the ARM architecture-based hosts, as well as making things more configurable in a more common manner. And there was also a niggling issue where we couldn't install with a medium to large release names, so we also want to address that as well. So the POC was very much about refactoring the ML API and the central ledger admin API services. So we defined the backend dependencies, as I mentioned previously, and we also did this in a standard way to handle the backend dependency configurations, ensuring the best practices are utilized best practices are utilized by using external secrets and provide support for service accounts to lock down what can and cannot be done by each Mojaloop services. We also have aligned the chart structure to the naming conventions to the reference architecture that we had a thing about earlier. The next bit is about also improving our testing capabilities and improving that we can run this version 14 on Kubernetes versions 1.2 to 1.22 and the interim version as well. So Tom has done a lot of great work here, and he'll talk a bit about Test Harness very shortly, and he'll take it through more detail. We do have a couple of issues that are still niggling or outstanding. One of them is we want to automate our testing through a CI/CD pipeline, and this will hopefully link with Tom's work that you'll see just now. We also want to get some feedback from the community on what we should support. In other words, what version of Ingress controllers are you guys using? What Kubernetes versions are you guys using? It would be very useful to get that feedback to understand what is the targets that we should be looking at and how we should actually extend our testing capabilities potentially. And lastly, we have one or two issues that have been pretty much picked up thanks to Tom's effort, which is very much about ensuring that we support Container D. So in future versions of Kubernetes, Docker is no longer kind of the default container runtime engine. Container D is now pretty much the default going forward. Not to say you can't use Docker going forward, but as I said, by default is Container D. We need to make sure we support that as well. And we also picked up an issue with our Ingress configurations, where if you have multiple Ingress controllers running in the same environment, we need to make a one or two small changes in our Helm charts to be able to support that as well. So I'm going to now hand over to Tom, who will take you through what he's been doing with regard to version 14 release. Tom, you want to share your screen?
Tom, you're still on mute.
Hi guys. Yeah, sorry. I just had an issue. So let me just share my screen and bring up the chart, the presentation. Oh, can you see my slides there?
Yep.
Cool. So, hi, for those who don't know me, Tom Daly. I'm actually Lewis's dad, but I've been working on automation and now I guess automation and testing
projects. So I've put together something called Mojaloop, so that essentially automates the micro K8's deployment in the instructions and just does that drop-dead easy fashion. And I've been using that as a test bed for the version 14 changes that Miguel's outlining. So essentially the problem statement that I'm just going to talk to you about is that we want to convert all of the Helm charts from Helm 2 to Helm 3, and with all the changes and customizations, including some of the breaking changes. And we want to have a tool in place so that we can test as we go, rather than try and get them working for 1.20, 1.21 and 1.22, only to develop against one of those releases and find out that we've got a lot of work to do on the charts that we've converted to get them to work for all three. So let's get a tool early to test all three versions, and let's make sure that it's actually automated. So, just to give some of the examples, not to go into too much depth, but there's changes in the networking API that when they're tested in one release, they simply don't work in another, and they need to be, in particular in version 1.22, they need to be incorporated. But there's also some other environmental challenges Miguel and I found when we were testing stuff. His rig on one version versus my rig in another, and we've made different assumptions. So having automated testing over three of the current Kubernetes versions seems like a really good place to start to improve our both our productivity and our accuracy with the conversion of the Helm charts. So for that end, I just sort of started writing something I called terribly version -test.sh. And all it does is basically put all of the infrastructure together for building and running the Helm charts, currently the POC, but when we get enough of them done, we'll be able to run the testing toolkit and all of the charts. But we can test as we go. So I'll just log in, just give you a flavour for it. I won't be able to show you the whole thing because, as you understand, it takes a little while to load up the Kubernetes release, add the Helm repos, deploy the backend chart, deploy the POC charts. But I'll give you a flavour. I'll show you a run through of how it works just very quickly. So I've just logged into my Kubernetes environment, of the Mojaloop environment that actually got here from Mojaloop. And then I'm going to go sudo sudo vagrant to my shared. Excuse me, I never really learned to type. And I'll just run -h to see. This is the little facility, and I'll show the output in a minute of actually running it against all three releases. So it takes a mode where you can just run it against one release and it doesn't reinstall the infrastructure. You can tell it which versions. You might label, say, all three versions, or you just might be testing on, say, 1.22 at the time or 1.20. Users, we might have different users in our environments, and number of seconds for the Helm charts to time out. And oops, that's a bug, ignore that one. But you get the idea. So it's pretty simple. And then just to show you the output of this, I hope this is large enough. I can zoom in a little bit more if it's not. Is that readable, Miguel? Yeah. So
it is for me.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So essentially what I did is I ran this the other night, and version.shell -m install. That means install the Kubernetes infrastructure and all of the supporting infrastructure to run, like the Helm chart, repos, etc. And importantly, the correct version of the Nginx ingress controller to match the version of the Kubernetes engine. Give it a timeout and do it for all of the versions. And you'll see what it did is it ran through. It added the. It says it's going to do the Nginx versions and then do the install, and it's going to do it for version 1.20, 1.21, and 1.22. And in fact, that's what it did. It ran. It installed K8's 1.220. It installed the writing ingress, and then what it did is it installed the backend charts that Miguel was talking about. So that's in this case MySQL and Kafka, a cow, a GUI for Kafka, etc. Then it deployed really the POC charts, so Mojaloop, as much of Mojaloop, the hub, as we've got there right now. And then it does a health check on the end. Now, eventually, when we get enough of this there, it'll also run the testing toolkit. Anyway, it does that same thing. It did it for 1.20, then it does it for 1.21, and it does it for 1.22. And at the end here, what we know is that the charts, the Mojaloop charts, deploy over three releases, and the ingresses work. We can get to their health checked endpoints so that we know that we're somewhere on the right track for so far in deploying and supporting these three releases. And that's really it. I want to get this working in the cloud and make it parallel because it's serial. And really love feedback about how we make this much more useful for CI/CD as well. But for that, I'm interested in infrastructure as a code, and you can see why I was asking about the business operations as well. Anyway, that's it for me.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Sam. Back to you. Always.
Thank you, Tom. Miguel, thank you. Let me share my screen again. Hi, David. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Let's continue with the infrastructure as code update. David, yeah, we'll pass on to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. So wanted just to give some updates about the IAC code that we've been talking about for quite some time, and wanted to finally do a public announcement on where we've gotten. We have made the repos public as of today. Some of them have been converted a while back, but we've been doing some finishing touches on them. There is documentation and release notes that are still evolving, as is noted there on number 4. But I have a feeling that as we start to work together with the different team members that are working on infrastructure, that there's going to be some good collaboration that's going to come out of this work, and there's going to be some changes in direction that will take us into different avenues. So I'm looking forward to it. Very happy to make this public release and start working together with the rest of the community to make this usable across many different implementations of Mojaloop. So just in a nutshell, we are supporting V13 and V12 with this release. And we are still using the Postman collection for the Golden Path tests for V13. We have initial support for TTK, but we have not actually put enough effort into TTK integration with the IAC. So that's one of the one of the components that I'm looking forward to having greater collaboration with the community on getting that over the line. There is, from other testing elements, there is test cafe test collections that are being executed for a finance portal. And we do have payment manager golden path tests collections that are being executed as a part of this IAC. So maybe one thing that I should have started off saying is what's included in this infrastructure as code. So I know that a lot of people are doing different efforts across the community within what could be termed infrastructure as code. So this effort has always been about creating a secure implementation of Mojaloop. And by secure, there are certain aspects that have always been included there. One is that mutual TLS is required for all API interactions from the participants into the switch. There is no access to Mojaloop without going through a API gateway, which in this case is WSO2. So the components that make up this infrastructure as code are obviously the core Mojaloop switch, but then decorating it are these other services, which would be the API gateway from WSO2, the identity server key manager, also from WSO2. Then we add elements such as Vault, and we have integrations between Vault and WSO2, as well as the HA proxies that are supporting the mutual TLS and other whitelist controls that have come about from previous implementations of Mojaloop and have found their way into what I would call the vanilla secure implementation of this IAC. So the other thing that's been built from the beginning is the notion that we need to run the golden path tests against the fully deployed switch, and we should be doing that in an automated fashion. So the other thing that is happening in this deployment is a separate cluster with simulators deployed to it is being provisioned that has to use mutual TLS and all the other security features in order to access the switch. And those participants are being used in order to run the golden path test. So it is as close to a full production simulation of a Mojaloop switch as could be has been possible to automate up till now. So in addition to that, what we've done is taken the payment manager deployments, and we have a separate code base for spinning up a more lightweight cluster for these payment managers to run in. But we are within the same pipeline using payment manager deployments into a separate cluster and running a golden path payment manager tests against the switches as well. So we're trying to, as much as possible, incorporate these products and run the golden path tests using full security across the board. So the other thing is that what we do as a part of the switch setup is we run Git Lab, and Git Lab is actually how we provision changes to the switch, how we provision the switch to begin with, and how we make changes to it in a controlled fashion. So I could share perhaps what that looks like.
Go ahead.
So let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so here we actually have the dev switch that's running within the OSS AWS account, and that's being used as a target for the BizOps framework development. And this is a view of the pipeline that is provided out of the box for a Mojaloop switch deployment. And the Mojaloop switch code base, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been donated and is now publicly accessible. So you can see there the various templates that make up the code base. Effectively, when we cut a release of that has certain versions of Terraform, Ansible, et cetera, that make up a functioning switch, including all the Helm releases and of different components, including the WSO2 and HA proxy, et cetera, as well as obviously the specified version of Mojaloop. The configuration of a particular switch is essentially you saying, I'm going to use a given release of that IAC code base, and I'm going to add some configuration changes, but we also give the ability to override any of the underlying Terraform that you wish in order to either do different alterations of how components are being deployed. Perhaps you want to use a different chart version than what's being used in the IAC, and that's all handled by the particular project. So in Git Lab, your project is called dev here, and you have the ability to overwrite files within the core IAC release with your own additions or modifications of those files. And it follows a kind of a sync directory that overwrites your versions on top of the core versions. And so with this, you're able to modify the core IAC to match what you're trying to do. And this is an example of adding in BizOps elements into the core IAC. So anyway, that's I know we don't have a lot of time, just wanted to give a little bit of description about the donation that's happened, how it could be utilized, and also emphasizing that I'm looking forward to working with the rest of the community on making this applicable to a lot of the other deployments that are going on in the community. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much, David. Let me start sharing quickly again. Do you want to cover anything on the roadmap side of things, David? So let me quickly go over here. So you touched on the business operations side of things. Anything else you want to touch quickly?
Well, we're going to be working closely with all of the V14 efforts, because obviously separating out the resources is going to be is going to have a large impact on the way that the IAC functions. Complete agreement with the approach, and have been working with and discussing this with Miguel and team. So we're looking forward to those changes. As I mentioned earlier, TTK, this is something that we really need to focus on and get over the line. And then payment manager, onboarding automation. This is would be a great enhancement to, we should say, payment manager and connection manager. So looking forward to that, because as we all know, onboarding is really the most painful part of the process for the switch. And so the more we can encourage automation in that process, the better for everybody.
Thank you very much, David. It's actually nice that you were able to share that. Thank you, Miguel, Tom, and Luis as well. So obviously the roadmap side of things will finalize on day 3 with community input and input from Mojaloop Foundation product. But I wanted to touch on one thing. So logically, we wish to continue the V13.10 and V14 as discussed. But one thing we are seeing, I wanted to highlight that and then wrap this or open up for questions, if any. So we've heard from Miguel and Luis about the PISP features that were coming. Initially, we thought they'll be published with V14, but for those features, we were ahead of timeline on that. So very glad to see that published and coming with V13.10. To add to what everyone said in this call, we are seeing a convergence of various work streams and deliverables from various work streams and into a single a kind of a thing, into a single, let's say, a product. So when we have V14, what we'd likely want to see, or we will see, is that along with the third-party payment initiation features, which are well tested, we will also have the finance portal V2 part of V14, along with the business operations features as well. So out of the box, with the Mojaloop deployment, we will have all these good things available, which are also configurable. So that's what we want to look at, and we'll discuss more of that in the roadmap if we get a session on the day 3 of the event. With that, I'll stop the presentation. Thanks, everyone.